Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the store's event director, and Community Bookstore is celebrating over 50 years of business. We credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. So thank you all for spending this evening with us. I'm very thrilled today to be collaborating once again with our friends at New York Review Books to welcome Gwendoline Riley for the US release of two of her novels, My Phantoms and First Love. She will be in conversation with author, scholar, and critic Merve Emre. Now, some housekeeping before I properly introduce our guests. You've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe setting, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button on the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, which is also at the bottom of your screen. We will be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box to which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's books if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that could arise. We will do our best to resolve them very quickly. Fall is always an exciting time for books, and we have a really stellar lineup of in-person and virtual events for you. So head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is this Thursday, September 15th. We're thrilled to welcome poet Yana Pickrell for an in-store event in celebration of her collection, Midwood. She'll be in conversation with New Republic literary editor Laura Marsh, and that program is up on our website now and taking registrations. So now, a little about tonight's guests, and we will get started. Gwendoline Riley is an English writer. Born in London, she published her first novel, Cold Water, in 2002. Her novel, First Love, was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Literature, the Dylan Thomas Prize, the Gordon Byrne Prize, and won the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. She has also been awarded a Betty Trask Award, a Somerset Maugham Award, and has been shortlisted for the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize. In 2018, the Times Literary Supplement named her one of the 20 best British and Irish novelists working today. And Merve Emre is Associate Professor of English at the University of Oxford. She's the author of Paraliterary, The Making of Bad Readers in Postwar America, the Ferrante Letters, and the Personality Brokers. She's finishing a book titled Post-Discipline, Literature, Professionalism, and the Crisis of the Humanities, and writing another book called Love and Other Useless Pursuits. She's a contributing writer at The New Yorker. Her essays and criticism have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Harper's, New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and the London Review of Books. This academic year, she is a distinguished writer-in-residence at the Shapiro Center at Wesleyan University. So now, without any further ado, I will leave it to you two. Gwendoline, Merve, thank you both so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, everyone who's joining us. Gwendoline, did you want to start with a very brief reading from the beginning of My Phantoms?
Well, yep. So I hope it doesn't need too much explaining. Here we go. There was nothing for him in England. There were no homes for heroes. Oh no, no homes for heroes. My grandmother said this indignantly, and if my mother was there, she used to shake her head and join in. There was nothing, no, nothing. They were talking about my grandfather, who'd worked in Venezuela after the war. My grandparents lived out there for 8 years in the Shell Oil Company camp on the eastern shore of Lake Maracaibo. Their house, a company house, was a large, well-appointed cabin on stilts. I remember various souvenirs of their time in Ven, dotted around my grandmother's flat. There were maracas in the fruit bowl, and on the mantelpiece over the gas fire, 2 painted wooden bookends in the shape of men drowsing under sombreros. They sat back to back with their arms crossed and their faces hidden. The photo albums lived under the coffee table. Here were pictures of the Colony Club and the tennis courts, of my grandparents' beaming American friends. My grandfather had been the photographer, but the perspective was a shared one, I think, on all of these unexpected things that had been theirs. There were very few pictures of my grandmother. There were pages of shots that were more sky than land, silvery grey, but somehow pulsing with glamorous heat. My mother was born in February 1949 in the hospital Karamoto. They called her Helen after my grandfather's mother, but she renamed herself effectively when her first attempts to pronounce that name produced instead a proud, high hen. My grandmother had thrilled to that, taking the fault as an audacity, which had naturally left her helpless. So then Helen was Hen, the resolute hen, the remarkable hen. I get stopped every few yards, she used to tell me of their daily trips to the commissary. She was just darling, everybody said so. She had been clever too. My grandmother and my mother were both keen to stress that, how she'd always been top of the class. It was in her teens back in England that her purchase seemed to slip. Her A-levels were a struggle, and then she failed the first year of her teaching course very badly. As per my grandmother, again, they had to beg, just beg, for her to be allowed to retake those exams. For her part, my mother told me she just went mad being away from home in London and free to do what she wanted. I just went wild, I just went mad, she said. And if you can remember the 60s, then you weren't there. I don't think anyone really imagined Hen would make a teacher, least of all her. Going to teacher training college was just what people did, she used to tell me indignantly. But she was a secretary. Later, she moved back up north and retrained in IT. She worked at Royal Insurance in Liverpool for nearly 30 years in an ugly building, an assemblage of dirty yellow blocks with arrow-slit windows, which she and her colleagues were encouraged to call the Sand Castle.
Thank you. I love that scene of naming the fault being misread as an audacity and leaving her helpless. And it was making me think about how the adults in this novel, as well as in First Love, are often compared to babies, to helpless creatures. So I thought I'd just pull out a couple of sections of First Love that we could talk about. So the description of Nev's father as a greedy child, a tyrant child. As a child with his toys, he exercised a capricious rule. His rage was hellish, were his schemes not reverenced. Or the ex-boyfriend Michael sounding like a teenage girl, the queenish self-regard, the untroubled belief in his ability to coax, to blandish. And then Elwyn helpless, a little boy in a tablecloth cap and cloak, and the mother in all that doll's tea party voice, self-enclosed. And I wanted to hear you say a little bit about the babyishness of the adults that often surround your first-person narrators, where that descriptive impulse comes from, what it's doing both at the beginning of My Phantoms and throughout First Love.
Where does the impulse come from? Well, that's a question, isn't it? I sort of just do it, and then you have to post-rationalize it, or someone points it out. That bit at the beginning of My Phantoms, after having written it, I realized it was quite like the beginning of Great Expectations, where Philip Pirrip says, my infant tongue could make no more of them than Pip. And Great Expectations could have been a sort of alternative title for My Phantoms in a way, because in a way, the curse of Helen or Hen's life is that she has this happy childhood, a golden childhood, which makes everything else seem, you know, terribly, upsettingly, traumatizingly disappointing. So the fact that she is still Hen and still has this stout little childhood nickname into, you know, old age, and really her whole life is just adds to the mockery, I suppose, of that whole situation. And I think the fact that I do that a lot in these last two books, perhaps maybe I could explain, as the narrators have had childhoods where the adults around them didn't do their jobs, you know, didn't meet their responsibilities, and so this sort of contempt has started to be forged down there. And what better way than to note the ways in which they're not being adult, they're not being grown up when this person has had to be. Does that make sense?
It
Is
does.
that plausible?
It makes perfect sense. And I think you are probably one of the greatest contemporary writers of contempt. And reading, not that you are, to be clear, not that you are contemptuous toward your reader, but that when I read your novels, and in particular, when I read First Love, I begin to recognize contempt as a feeling that is distinct from mere anger or disgust. And part of it has something to do, as you said, with having a first-person narrator who perceives the people around her as tyrannical babies over whom she towers, but whose demands she is still somehow beholden to. And I just want you say a little bit more about contempt, since it seems important for you. It does a kind of a work in your novels. How is it different from being angry with one's parents or one's lover, to feel contemptuous, to contempt them?
It's a much higher emotion, obviously. Let me think. I mean, I've written several novels before I got to these two. I think these two are, they leap forward. They're much better novels. They work much better as novels. They come together and they have more dimensions to them. And I think part of that, all of these novels, by the way, were written in the first person. Part of that was me learning in these last two novels just what you could do with the first person, and just that quality of observing others and what it means to really train a laser eye on people in that way. Because it's not kind. It can be sort of compulsive. It's not usually helpful. If you can see what someone's up to and know why they're behaving the way they are, what use is that? Do they want to hear that? Not really. Does it help you in the moment? Not really. But it makes for an interesting, in a novel, it sort of can make for an interesting pattern. And I think, I also like, I mean, it was obviously different in his case, obviously, but Fitzgerald would talk about great writing, I think, being maximum emotion under maximum control. And I do like that idea. So in As You Like It, perhaps, can't remember, where is Jacques? When he says he vents in mangled forms about Touchstone. People who are sort of venting in mangled forms, the idea that the writing is very controlled, but slightly mangled, written in good faith. I think the narrators are not unreliable narrators, but there are such pressures on them that what they're writing and what they're observing is, I don't know, as I say, sort of mangled and strange. And contempt, I guess, one of those forces, certainly.
Well, there's a judgment in contempt that's interesting, right? Because when you feel contemptuous, you're placing yourself above the people toward whom you feel contemptuous. But to me, at least, what's interesting is that the narrator of First Love, the narrator of My Phantoms, often seems to be doing that to guard against the pain that those people historically have caused her and still can cause her. You never get the sense that these stories are over. They feel like they're still kind of live wires, and contempt has to be what's, the barrier that is always up, that is always asserting one's separateness, one's superiority to those who are capable of doing harm.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look, the other thing I do is compare people to animals. But if you look at sort of chimps fighting, the chimp that's being attacked will sort of run up a tree and start screeching at people. So I think it might be similar.
Right.
The contempt, she's got, I'm getting to a superior position now, and I'm going to chatter at you from up there.
From up there, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you just said something interesting about figuring out what you can do with the first person in these novels. I mean, one is the ability to use the first person to judge other people, or to judge your cast of characters sort of implicitly, right? The other thing that I think you do very interestingly with the first person is give us different ways of paying attention to people. And that's another thing that I sort of notice in the novels, that there are different ways to pay attention to other people. There are good ways of paying attention to them. There are unsatisfying ways. There are unbearable ways of paying attention to them. There's that wonderful moment in First Love when the narrator is meeting up with her flame, ex, whatever, and thinks, the attention I was paying felt like an awful kind of attention, but I didn't know how to dilute it. Could you just speak a little bit about what it means to pay an awful kind of attention? What is an unawful kind of attention that you could pay to another person?
Oh God. Well, I'd have to be a different kind of writer. Let me think. In that particular instance, well, I think it's a very similar dynamic. He's not quite a flame, he's not quite an ex, he's not quite an anything in that situation. And it's not clear what she wants from him, which I think is also something that runs through the books and through these relationships. What does she want from them? There seems to be, in that case, the whole thing's doomed. They're having this drink together, but the whole thing's doomed. So she's observing him and thinking, I can see right through him. Well, again, big deal. It's not going to help her, is it?
No. Well, that's what's so painful about that encounter to me is that, one of the reasons people pay attention to other people would be to understand their sense of reality or what their reality is as opposed to your reality. And that encounter is so marked in my mind. And I think in the prose by him arriving and wanting to kind of re-narrate the relationship that they had so that she will sign on to his version of reality. And I think we've all had this experience, right? When someone says, no, it happened this way. And you think, well, if only we paid proper attention, we would be, inclined not to do that. But it actually turns out it doesn't matter that people will sort of impose their realities or their fictions on us and ask us to authorize them. Which is something else that you see. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm just saying that's kind of the whole arc of First Love, is that you're seeing it from Neve's perspective. Again, there's this when things, her husband is Edwin, who does some rotten things. I'm not saying he doesn't, but at the end, he's really, wrestling with her in this conversation to say, I have my own reality. I have my own being. Does that matter to you? And it's not quite clear if it does. You can sort of feel these facts almost bouncing off her as she tries to, continue writing her own view of things. And that's where I wanted to end that, which wasn't quite to undermine everything she said so far, but just to say he is a person too. He has his own history. He has his own childhood. He's experienced this turbulence. We don't know whether he's done this as a habit with every woman he's ever been involved with, or whether this is some uniquely dreadful misalliance. But I did want to just twist it that way at the end, where he's saying, I have my own reality. And it's not clear whether she's ready to acknowledge that, or if she's so far in her own bunker, maybe.
I'm very glad you did that, because otherwise it's just too easy to write him off as a kind of misogynist or a monster by the time you get to the end. I'm happy that twist exists for that reason.
I think misogynists and monsters and gargoyle people, they do exist, and it's worth putting them in fiction sometimes. But I think this book would have been a bit naff if I'd done it that way. I wouldn't have been happy with it. It just been, a rather righteous narrator saying, look at this trap I've fallen into. It had to be a bit more, you could turn it to the light and see things a little bit differently, I think.
Well, but it seems like in both novels, part of what makes, you have this great line in First Love where you say, life is appalling. And it seems like part of what makes life appalling is that it's very hard to turn it to the light. It's very hard to take a situation and see it, to step outside of what you take to be your own reality and see it in any other way. We do seem particularly helpless when it comes to acknowledging the reality of other people.
Yep. And it's why I read. It's why I like reading. Yet at the same time, I also put that in First Love that Edwin is saying to Neve, you read all the time, but does none of this ever penetrated you that there might be other ways of looking at things? And you do wonder, but of course, yeah, it's terrifically hard. In both of these novels, really, there is a sort of good faith attempt, especially in My Phantoms, there's a good faith attempt by the narrator to understand her mother. But what you can have all the good faith in the world, but we are limited creatures, and there are things that she just can't see about her mother's situation because of, I suppose, in some ways, certain advantages she has, but also just some primal niggling frustration that she can't quite get over, or maybe a little bit of resentment from childhood. Who knows? It's her motives are a bit murky, aren't they?
They are murky, but I think it's also interesting that it isn't purely contempt, that contempt in your novels does open onto pity, and it occasionally opens onto real tenderness. And I think that that's a difficult balance to strike in in fiction as in life, it's very easy to tip over onto one side of that or the other, to either be too cruel or to be too indulgent.
Yeah, no, I wanted to be walking that wire, especially in my Phantoms. There's terrible moments of pity and moments of real fear when she sees just how lonely a person can be. She's looking at her mother, her mother's life goes horribly wrong. And I mean, and as well as Great Expectations, I was thinking, I noticed again, reading it through, you know, the beginning, there's that word nothing that just strikes and strikes and strikes so many times in the opening lines, a little bit like King Lear, maybe. But there's this whole nothingness and emptiness that's underneath the whole book in a really frightening way. And it really is frightening. And to look at her mother and see that she can't help her and that she's not getting through. And when that happens in one conversation or in one situation, okay, but when it's happened over the course of decades, as with any sort of problem, I suppose, a person will find themselves approaching it almost, you know, I'll try this now, I'll try that now. So I think in the book, I wanted to write her sort of coming at her mother from different angles, seeing if anything could ever get through. But after so long of doing that, when something finally does get through, some way through the book, it's almost too late, and neither of them quite know what to do with the moment when there might be a little bit of communication between them.
Could you just say when it is that you feel like something gets through? Because to me, it strangely, it's at the very end when they're watching Columbo together that it feels like there's some moment, there's something shared as pathetic and as belated as it is. But what is that moment for you in My Phantoms?
Well, I think the moment when the mother's sort of, the daughter is trying to palm the mother off, and she's saying, "Oh, get it, you know, why don't we get you a therapist, mum?" And the mum's sort of playing along, and then the mum sort of gets into it and says, "Oh yeah, there are things I've never told anyone, things your father did." And the daughter doesn't go, "Oh, tell me about it." She says, "Yeah, okay, should we try this guy?" And keep sort of tapping away on her laptop. "This guy is quite local to you. Should we look at him for you to tell this to, instead of telling me?" I think that moment when it turns out she doesn't want to know, or she thinks it's too late, but I don't know, it's totally hard in life. There are times when you just don't meet the moment, when afterwards you might think, "Oh, that was when it could have come out. It didn't, my fault."
Or when you think that what's demanded is privacy or withdrawal or some kind of respectful distance rather than the extension of intimacy, or yeah.
Exactly. And I thought it was quite, it just seemed it was quite a difficult moment to arrange in the book, because I wanted to write these scenes of them trying to talk and it never quite coming off and missing each other. And I couldn't do them so much that it was alienating or boring to read. So you had to sort of indicate how things were going. And then to sort of work up to this moment where it almost happens. And then I think I have the daughter making the exact same noise that the mother's been making all the way through the book. I can't remember what the little phrase is now, but some little batting off phrase. Suddenly the daughter's saying it.
Cuckoo.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's like I thought, you know, it's like in a horror movie or a conspiracy movie where you think, "Oh shit, that person's in on it too. That person's the same. That person's had got an aliens on," you know, that kind of thing. It's like, "Oh crap, the one person she's turned to is exactly that way too." So I wanted to just have that little moment of true in there, I guess.
Well, it's interesting that moment is a moment where one person recommends therapy to another, because there are analysts sort of looming in the background of both of these novels, both Neve deciding not to go to psychoanalysis anymore, and then thinking about all the things she can do with the money that she's not spending on psychoanalysis. But also John in My Phantoms is an analyst who offers that sort of very textbook diagnosis of Bridget's mother that, you know, in some ways is meant to, I think, stands as a foil to everything the novel is doing, right? That's how the diagnosis is telling us. The novel is showing us in a much more shattering kind of way what it is.
Exactly, because I did think it would be funny to give her an analyst as a boyfriend. I mean, not to sound crass, but I thought, oh, that'll be quite funny, because spends so many decades agonizing over her parents. Marvelous. And then for him to just meet her for 5 minutes and say, oh yeah, this is obviously how her mind works, and this was always going to happen, and that was always going to happen. Isn't it sad? And Neve is sort of, not Neve, Bridget is left sort of awake, just lying awake going, oh, was that it? Is that problem solved?
Yeah, so what is this? I mean, what are these psychoanalysts doing lurking in the background of your novels? Are they a kind of, is the work of the psychoanalyst a foil to the work of the novelist? Or are they just two different ways of coming to know or paying attention to people?
I think I love Philip Roth so much that I just thought I want to stop putting analysts in my novels. I think maybe that. Okay. I think a novel is not complete without one. I don't know.
Without an analyst in it, yeah. Without a boyfriend analyst in it.
Deal, obviously, we're aspiring to that. Yeah. I'm trying to remember if there's one in my previous. There's one in the previous four. There is one there. I've never been in analysis myself, so it's a bit fantastical maybe, but yeah. But you're right. Yeah, it's a foil because the novel is doing everything that diagnosis doesn't do, and it's again show. What does she do with this information once she's got it? Right. I don't think it's useless. I think it's interesting, but it's at the same time it doesn't actually. It's not really gonna help her, but I suppose analysis isn't supposed to help, is it? It's just understand.
Well, I like that you keep coming back to the idea of uselessness, and the uselessness of knowing other people or figuring them out. I mean, there's a moment where Neve says something like, it was all so helpless. The other world, that's what I had to guard, art. Right, where I feel lack or loss, where I need to take that is into the world of art. That and we could say that that's maybe as useless as
no.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. It's a refuge, isn't it? I think in both of those books, I've showed them gravitating. No, it's not just a refuge. Of course, it's understanding and it's absorption and it's creative. It's everything really. But I think for Neve, she's always just picked up a book. I think not as escape, but as accessing intelligence and things that give her stimulation and pleasure and a little bit of rationality, even that kind of thing. So
I mean, we've talked a little bit about the novels that are in the background here, but before we started the event, you and I were talking about Terence Davies's films. And I was saying that I had watched last night Distant Voices, Still Lives, and was thinking about your novels in connection with that film, actually, and with his trilogy, as we were talking about, in part because I think that they share a sort of similar tableau quality. I mean, I find that incredible about Davies's films, particularly about Distant Voices, Still Lives, the stillness from which violence can kind of suddenly erupt, but also just thinking about what you just said about art as a refuge. There are many very beautiful moments in those films, but you never get the sense that the art is compensating for the horrors, or redeeming the horrors of poverty, of abjection, right? I mean, so yeah, I just wanted to hear you talk about a little bit about Davies, because there are lots of parallels there, I think, between your work and his.
Well, I don't think art can redeem suffering, alas. But in his films, especially in The Long Day Closes, I mean, I think the cinema, he said, became for him what the Catholic Church had been. He went there and that's how he felt. It was communal. There were people all around. They were all looking up at the cinema screen. So I think that's where that fits for him. And he's a great fan of Virginia Woolf, which I think you can see in Four Quartets. And But Distant Voices Still Lives, I think the moment I always remember from that film is the children are watching the mother, played by Frida Downey, washing the window and saying, don't fall, ma'am, please don't fall. And then the question is, then they go, why did you marry him, ma'am? About their violent dad. It's such a beautiful sequence. Why did you marry him, ma'am? And then Ella Fitzgerald's Falling in Love Again, or Taking a Chance on Love comes on, and you see Pete Postlethwaite, the father, bashing her to bits in the hallway of this little terrace house. And I think that's a question that I think the narrators of my books have asked, why did you marry him, ma'am? Since the first book I wrote, which I wrote when I was 21. It's the question. And I think maybe, yeah.
Why is that? Sorry, why? I just want to press on that. Why is that? No, and this isn't asking personally or autobiographically. It's asking more. Why is that the question for one character to ask another? Why return to it in every single novel?
Well, that's a good point. Again, it's something that you sort of notice looking back and think, oh God, what's that all about? I mean, it's not cryptic what it's all about, but again, it's sort of looking into motives. And, you know, finally at the age of 40 odd, I can say, well, it's what a silly question. Why does anyone marry anyone? Is it because they assess their qualities and think, gosh, they'd be, you know, a great match? Not sometimes maybe, but aren't there? But I just think that was the bit of something that they couldn't get over, I think, for those first few books. And that, again, that's just a little bit childish maybe, isn't it, to have such an outrage about that kind of thing? You know, it's like a child sort of stoutly saying, that's not true, why are you lying? You know, children would get very stout about these, you know, outraged about these things. How could you marry him? But you know, the answer in the film is he was nice, he was a good dancer. And the answer could be nothing more deeper than that, really.
Well, the two scenes in the film that I always remember, the one, the scene where he creeps into their room. They're all asleep in the bed. The three children are asleep in the bed. And it's a very beautifully lit scene. And he places that little basket with the gifts. And he says, you know, God bless you, children. And then in the very next scene, they're sitting at that table and his hands are clenched in rage and he pulls everything off of the screams to the mother. He says, come clean it up. And you know, I think the other reason I was thinking of your novels is particularly a character like Edwin, that contrast, seeing people in the dark, but lit by the glow of goodness, and in the light, but all of their faults, all their darkness exposed. That seems to be how you too in First Love, and in My Phantoms at least. Yeah.
Well, his editing and the way he moves between it is fantastic. And of course, you want to, in a book, you don't want to. I mean, I'm not of the keep everything out or the put everything in school, but I do want to sort of I do want to do some, you know, go from one to the other, find some elegant link between two sections, find some line that you can turn things on. I don't know, but very much going from one to the other.
There's one of the kind of one of the accusations in First Love that really sticks with me is when Edwin tells Neve toward the end, he says, you're not interested in love, you're interested in the need for love, or what we have isn't love, what we have is the need for love. What's the difference between those two things? I don't know that there is necessarily a difference between those two things. What's the difference between those two things?
I don't know.
Okay.
I know that it wouldn't be nice to hear someone say that to you. I suppose one is more selfless, I guess, isn't it? But other than reaching for platitudes at this point, I don't know what else I could sort of add to that. But he's quite clear on that, isn't he?
I mean, it's quite a devastating. Well, I mean, it's in the same kind of speech where he's accusing her of being infantile, narcissistic, ego-driven, all that language of psychology comes in there, or psychoanalysis comes in there quite, it's weaponized.
Yep.
In there. But yeah, I mean, it's accusing someone of feeling lack.
Yeah.
Which everyone feels, right? He's accusing her of being human in some way. And that's
say that.
To be accused of. It's painful to be accused of being human, or merely human.
Yeah, that's very well put. Yeah. Oh.
I'm going to switch to the Q&A because we are at that moment in the evening. Let us see. An anonymous attendee, coward, says, I'm just joking, sorry. Says, not a question so much, but regarding the struggle to write one's own story, yet to recognize, to accept the other, wholeheartedly accept another person, their will, their purpose. I did preface this by saying it's not a question so much, but if you have anything you want to say to the ability to recognize or to accept the other while also narrating one's own reality or writing one's own fiction.
I think it wasn't something I was setting out to do in these last two books. I was doing something where the whole power came from being inside this one person's head and what they were what they saw, what they noticed, the patterns they were putting together about various other people's behavior, and how, in both cases, it was people wondering how they'd ended up where they had. So recognizing other people's reality, I think, might be the next stage for them, but it hasn't I think in My Phantoms, part of the reason I gave it that title was because I was sort of anticipating what would happen after the events of the book, and whether there would be this, dreadful moment when Bridget, who narrates the book, would suddenly start to really understand what her mother had been going through, or not. I mean, it doesn't always happen that way. It might be that she doesn't really think of her mother again for the rest of her life. But it might be that something begins to seep in after what happens in the book with regards to other realities.
No, that's very interesting to hear you say, because there's a sense in these books, and I think somewhere in First Love, Neve even says it explicitly, that there is, that these narrators don't think about the future. That they're always just kind of trying to get through or move from one point to another. And so it's very interesting to hear you say that as the author.
No, that's completely true. Even
yeah.
Point where in the book I'm currently writing, it's all about the future. And I sort of thought, I've got to try and, turn this bloody cruise ship around here. And look at the future, because it was always so, look, I might not end up doing it that way, but I did think these last two, it was people with their backs against the wall going, how on earth did it end up like this for me? Or in My Phantoms, I suppose a little bit more, how on earth did it end up like this for my mother? And there was so much that came into that, from her childhood, from being, in this, being a glamorous expat, then being back in the swinging 60s, then how this sexual revolution was not much use to her in the end, and all this that sort of came into how her mother ended up quite so stranded. But I did try and think, I've got to sort of turn to the future a little bit now, and it's a bit of a head twist, but I'm because it doesn't come naturally to me. But I think that I'm going to hope, as always when you're writing, you try and make these problems into the essence and make them into what's interesting. So we'll see if I manage it or not. Can
you say a little bit more about that project? Is it another first person narrator?
It is, but to the extent that she's sort of, it's all free and direct. She's sort of telling the story of what's happened to a group of her friends, and there's not much of her that comes into it. It's not so fraught. So maybe I'm giving away my superpower, but it's not so fraught. It's what happens to them, and you have to just suspend disbelief a little bit that she's sort of, I'm transitioning. to being a third person narrator through this book.
It's a slow, you'll do it over the course of another two or three novels. Yeah. Actually, that links up nicely to a question that Lynn Strong has. I love this idea of maximum control and maximum emotion. And wonder, I think were you quoting Fitzgerald?
Yeah, I think so.
It doesn't matter. And wonder if you could talk more about toggling between the two as you work. So where does maximum emotion come in? Where does maximum control come in?
I'm very low on emotions, I'm afraid. So no, that's not true. I don't splurge and write a hell of a lot and then edit it down. I sort of have, that all happens in my head now, really. So I am, again, like Roth says, it's turning sentences around. So for me, it is sitting there going over the same 300-400 words a day, if that, but trying to get them, if that, and certainly trying to get them, taking out anything that doesn't need to be there, and really thinking how the narrator would see things and how they would react to what they're writing, if that makes sense. So I think I do kind of interject a little bit in the why always Dorothea type school, just why am I saying this? Why is that? This kind of thing. I try, and so I think I get quite a lot of wrestling with oneself into the individual sentences or paragraphs. So someone really trying to interrogate what they're writing as they're writing it, if that doesn't sound too deadly, rather than a big gush or spate that I then tamp down. It's more in this tensile strength of somebody thinking, why am I using that word? Why am I saying that? But is that quite accurate? No, let's have 3 images and refine them through the paragraph. That kind of thing, I think, is how I do that at this point.
Yeah, I think you say something about how there's a very an awful kind of deliberateness in examining one's
something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you see that deliberateness come through in the way any statement your narrator makes is often turned.
A horribly delicate determination, in fact.
Horribly delicate determination. Oh, I apologize.
No, it's just as good. It's the same. Yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah, and I think you see that in the way that constant self-questioning is the motor of how thought moves in your novels.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's both, uncertainty and also control being exercised in those questions. Yeah, that's great. Elaine Durbach, is there a conflict for you in being an author, doing something so intensely personal and putting it out into the world to be read by hordes of strangers?
The word hordes has never applied to my books. No, not really. I'm not going to run into them. I look nothing like my author photo either. It's very flattering. So I'm safe. Is there a conflict? No, not really. I mean, well, it's never directly autobiographical. I suppose it can't help but be revealing in a certain way, but I don't know how anyone would really, I don't see how anyone would turn that against you, really. That's very naive sounding, maybe. I don't, that seems to be the whole point. I mean, it's not my life I'm writing about, although there's obviously, nothing's come from nowhere, but it hasn't come, they aren't same people or characters, so that doesn't really apply. No, I can't say that is something that from my point of view anyway, doesn't seem to, when I get so absorbed in it, when one doesn't think about it, I suppose you're so absorbed in it, you forget that hordes or even scores of people might read it.
Stampedes of people.
Yes, Shea Stadium. No.
Holding up #1 foam hands that have your name on them. Yeah. Actually, that shockingly segues very nicely into Robert Hayes's question, which is, you've been more widely published in the UK than the US. Do you think there's a difference in the audiences or how they respond to your work? Is there anything about your work that's particularly British? The naive American addition to this might be, do the Americans know what the North is or how that's wielded in First Love as a
yeah, I wonder.
Yeah.
I don't think I don't think there's a direct equivalent between the north of England and the south of America. I don't know what the equivalent would be at all. I like the bit at the end of Absalom, Absalom, where Quentin is asked, why do you hate the South? And he's like, I don't hate the South. I don't, exclamation mark. I don't hate the South. Well, I do hate the North. I do, exclamation mark. No, I don't really. But I don't live there anymore. But I think the North-South thing in my books, there's often people from the North who travel to the South. And I don't know, maybe it's a bit more like in Ferrante, those who leave, and those, maybe it's more like Naples and something like that. But you can't escape if you're Northern, it's there. You can hear it, can't you? I've thought about getting elocution lessons because it bothers me, so not really. Can
you do a posh accent? No.
I think I can, but I'm told it's a terrible, it doesn't come off. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if Sheila Delaney means anything to Americans. She wrote a play called A Taste of Honey when she was very young. She was from Salford, Manchester. And I sort of ripped it off a little bit for my Phantoms because it's a mother-daughter and the mother is called Helen. Same. And they do have this, you know, appallingly fractious relationship and they're sort of trapped together. And I suppose the way they talk has sort of come through a little bit to my characters too, which is a bit larky, a bit facetious, a bit needly, you know, these sort of childish chants of catchphrases that they do at each other. I think Delaney was sort of put in with the kitchen sink stuff of the 60s, but she played the part of a naive. When she wrote to Joan Littlewood with this play, she said, I'd never been to the theatre before last week. Now I've written a play. And it was, wow, what a prodigy. But she'd been studying theatre for a long time and she loved Samuel Beckett. And you can see that in the play because it's the mother and daughter, they're sort of two characters yoked together. Their situation is absurd and distressing. So it's quite Beckettian. And I did think a little bit of, you know, trying to carry that over a little bit into my Phantoms, but who left and sort of moved to London. A couple of plays after that. She wrote a play about someone leaving London to go back to Manchester. In fact, Charlie Bubbles. That was made into a film with Albert Finney. Anyway, it's a great name. I'm digressing.
Well, Ferrante is an interesting touchstone, not just because she appears in My Phantoms, and I think that text exchange is extremely both sort of pitiful and quite funny, but you know, one of the things she writes, or her narrator thinks and writes in the first volume, is she says there was nothing romantic. Romantic isn't the right word. I can't remember what it is, but she says there was nothing romantic about, you know, the poverty of our childhood. There's an absolute refusal to try to romanticize the anger, the abjection, the filth is a word that, you know, comes up, I think, in My Phantoms and in First Love repeatedly. There's absolutely no attempt to try to romanticize poverty or to romanticize the sort of filth of it. And that's one place where I think Davies's work also makes me think a little bit of yours.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, it's the sort of single parent families it's not poverty, and it's not filth, but the narrators come to feel that there's a squalor there. Yeah. And I think in First Love, the mother isn't coping, so things do get squalid. And I have written in the past about a mother who's a hoarder as well. And it's this sense of, again, it's this, but this, I think the squalor that the narrator is reacting to is something slightly different. And of course, once she gets away, she becomes a little bit of a snob about that. But I don't think I was writing about poverty. It was just, you know, it was what the author wanted, what the narrator wanted to get away from. And so once she'd done that, you know, it was all looked back on a little bit haughtily, really. But you know, the north is certainly poorer than the bits of London where the narrators of these two books end up.
Yeah. Let us make a fan of yours very happy. Phoebe Brown says, hello, I revere you. I was wondering if you might be willing to clarify the end of Cold Water in any way. The novel absolutely lives in me, and I consider her plight constantly. I wonder where you see her now, if anywhere.
I see her sitting in a West London living room. No. Let me think. Well, I don't think she should go to Cornwall, because at the end she's thinking of going to, I don't think that would be a very terrifically good idea, especially not post-Brexit. Let me think.
She probably wouldn't be able to get there. Post-Brexit. Nothing works.
I think to Americans, you know what Coronation Street is? A long-running soap opera in England. Started in the 60s. A absolutely wonderful gay man wrote it, about all the powerful women and matriarchs he used to see around his streets in Salford. He was called Tony Warren, and he was on the judging committee for a prize for Manchester novels that Cold Water was up for, and it didn't win, but he came up to me afterwards in his dicky bow, absolutely lovely guy, and he went, oh, he said, I loved this book about this bomb I'd out. He said, such pretty words. I was stroking the pages. It's about the very early stages of alcoholism, isn't it? And I thought, Christ, is it? I don't think it was, but at the end, she's got these ulcers in her mouth, hasn't she? I think she turns her life around. I don't know. Very, very lonely, strange ending. I'm not going to tell you. They're not real people. What am I doing speculating about what she's up to?
What are you doing? I'm actually surprised that you took that. I'm surprised you took the bait. I did
take the bait. You know, because
what are you doing?
Because there was flattery, and I couldn't.
Yeah. All right. We have one more question that Phoebe says, thank you. You're very welcome. You're very welcome, Phoebe. You managed to trick her with flattery. Final question. You write brilliantly in dialogue. Will you write a play, a screenplay, or actually, given what you just said about your inspiration for My Phantoms, would you write for the theater?
No, because that would mean there were actors involved putting their interpretation on my words, and that is not why I got into this business. Mine. My fondness for italics, I think, is sometimes actually leaning on people physically. This is how it's said. So I don't know if I would cope very well with that. But it might be I mean, I do like writing dialogue, but I like writing the in between bits too. You know, bit of dialogue, bit of description, bit of weather, bit of reflection, weather, dialogue. I like breaking it up. So I don't know. Look,
can
never say never.
Can I just ask something about your love of italics?
Yes.
Which are everywhere. You don't. So that's because you don't like being interpreted. You want people to hear it exactly. I guess this goes back to Lynn's control question and what you said. You are resistant to interinterpretation.
No, I like. Well, you know, yeah, probably.
It's okay to say yes. It's okay to say it's fine.
I am. I'll just say, ideally, of course, I wouldn't need those italics, and I must say I don't know that they work, because when I've heard audiobooks, the italics are ignored.
I heard them differently in my head.
Okay.
So I'd like you to be a little more controlling, or find ways to be more controlling. All right. Thank you, Gwendoline, so much. Thank you, Noah, and everyone at Community. Thank you to everyone who came. You can buy the book in any one of the, 7 or 8 links that have been thrown into the chat. Follow any one of them. They're both fantastic. Thank you, Gwendoline. I am happy that I got to tell you that I think you're our foremost writer of contempt, because I've been thinking that for several months now. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
It's the garland every writer wants, and it's not.
And you wear it well. Yes, thank you both so much. This was really a very thoughtful conversation, and I had a blast watching it. I could listen all night, but Gwendoline, it's very late where you are, so we should probably let you log off. Those of you at home, thanks again Merve did my job for me. Buy the book, and we'll see you at another virtual event very soon. Take care.
Thank you. Cheerio.
Bye, everybody.